Well, good morning. Good morning. I'm Andrew Colby, for those who don't know, but many of you know who I am because I've been going to this church since about 8th grade. And many of you helped sponsor me to go this summer and work with an organization called Next Step Ministries. What Next Step Ministries is, it's an organization that facilitates mission trips for youth groups. They provide the place to stay, the food to eat, the materials, the tools, and worship every single night. My specific job over the summer was to be the speaker each and every night. And so as I thought of a way to say thank you for helping me to experience the things I experienced over the summer, I thought I might give you a glimpse into the meat of a Next Step worship service. So typically how a Next Step worship service works, we sing and everything like that, and we praise God. But Next Step puts out a video series each and every summer based on a theme. And this video series this summer was called Beyond the Shadows. And it talked about a story called Plato's Allegory of the Cave. And Plato's Allegory of the Cave talks about reality and what truth really is. And it describes it through telling the story of people who have lived inside a cave their entire lives and have never experienced the outside world. And so after each and every video, I would speak afterwards, and I would go into depth about what you heard. So now I'm going to do the same to you. So in just a second, I'm going to talk, but first, I'd like you to see this video.
Plato has an allegory of a cave that paints the image of a group of people who have been bound and chained to the wall of a cave for their whole lives. And they're bound in such a way that they can only see the cave wall in front of them. And behind them is a fire. And so their whole experience of reality is just the shadows cast on the cave wall in front of them from the flames of the fire behind them. The allegory goes on and shares someone comes down and releases him from the chains of this wall and starts to bring him out of this cave. You can imagine the fear, the way the light as they're moving to the mouth of the cave would burn in your eyes. There'd be temporary blindness from the pain. It would be an intimidating thing to walk into a new reality when your whole life, your whole paradigm is this simple set of shadows on a wall. And in real life, it's kind of like that. You know, we all have our perception of reality, our paradigm, our little box that we live in. And the idea of getting pulled out of that sometimes can be a scary thing. And until you overcome that, what's really real is something you don't even want to face. You'd rather go back to the comfort and the lack of pain and the security of being bound and chained to this wall in a cave. And when we pursue the truth and reality in our lives, sometimes it can be scary like that. The same idea is kind of presented in 1 Corinthians 13 in the Bible, where it says, now we see as a reflection, as in a mirror, and then we will see face to face. Now we only know in part, but then we will know in full, even as we are fully known. That's the idea that we want to talk about today, is this thought of what does it mean to get past looking at the shadows, to really understand, why are we here? What's this all about? Why did he create me and this universe? I remember when I was a kid, I was an only child and I spent a lot of time alone. And so I would go out into nature and I would just enjoy creation. I'd walk in the forest, I'd look for animals. I always loved animals. I believed God existed. I believed he was real and that he created everything, because everything just seemed way too beautiful to happen by itself. Like, the fact that it existed means something created it. But I didn't know where I fit into that. I felt like, would a God that made all of this really care about me or really have a plan for my life? There's no real way I could measure up or be big enough to impress God or be worthy of his love. I used to kind of seek him as a child. I remember I would like test him. I was in my room and I would put my matchbox on the floor and I'd be like, God, if you're real, can you make this car fly across the room? Or can you speak to me in an audible voice? And when it didn't happen, it caused doubt in me. It caused me to fear, like, well, he really must not care about me. I must not be special enough for him to want to connect with me. For a long time in my journey, I didn't really feel like God cared about me. I thought he was real and I thought Jesus was real and all that kind of stuff, but it didn't really matter to my life. And life seemed kind of empty and without purpose for me. I didn't know what to do and was kind of lost. Kind of like being bound to that cave wall and just seeing the shadows. Like, what's the use? Yeah, the world is beautiful, but I don't feel beautiful, and who really cares? One of my favorite books in the Bible is Genesis. I love to learn what started everything, why did it all come to place, and what's the reason and the purpose. And we see this beautiful story in Genesis about God creating. It says that God spoke the world into the existence. He spoke the universe into the existence. And the cool thing is, now in history, science tells us that the universe is constantly expanding. It's like God is so big, so powerful, that his sound waves from way back when he created the universe are still going and still creating. And in this massive expression of God's omnipotence, his power, and his beauty and his majesty, God creates the world. And he creates this garden called the Garden of Eden. There was a river flowing through the garden that gave life to the plants around it. There were these trees and everything was good. And then he puts this muddy frame that he molds out of the clay of the earth and breathes into this frame the breath of life, the object of his affection. And we see this story unfold of this God of love, this massive, all-powerful being creating humans for intimacy, for relationship. And he walked in the cool of the day, face to face, side by side with Adam and Eve. They knew him. They were fully known. And they fully knew God. And that's what God wants for you and for me. He created all of this for us, to show his love to us and to show you are the object of my love. So our search for significance ends in our encountering God. And I think so many of us, we look at not the beauty in the world, but we look at the sorrow and the pain and our failure and our fear. I ride motorcycle, and when you're riding motorcycles, there's this thing called fixation, where what you look at is where you go. So if your road is going on a curve and you're worried about flying off the side of the road, if you fixate on that, that's exactly what's going to do. Even if you're riding nice and slow and you can make the thing, where you look is where you go. And I was looking at what I didn't like and what I didn't want, what I was unhappy about myself. I was looking at my failures, and I didn't feel like I could ever measure up, and I didn't feel like God cared for me. I was focused on those things, and that's where I was going. And I kind of just threw this prayer up to God, and it wasn't even like very faith-filled, like, well, if you're real, maybe lead me into something and show me what to do. And I felt like maybe I should go to Bible college down in Dallas, Texas, and if not, at least I'm away from home and living on my own. And when I drove in my 76 Ford Granada loaded with all my junk down to Dallas, Texas after I graduated from high school, and I got out of my car at that campus, at that Bible college, I felt the presence of God. I didn't even know I was still in a cave, and at that point it was the cave of religion instead of having a relationship. I believed in this religious thing called Christianity, but I still had no idea when the pastor said, oh, God told me to go to the coffee house and talk to this person. I'm like, I'd never encountered that. I had never known God in an intimate way. And that little taste of stepping outside of the cave and seeing the reality that I had been living a lie changed everything. I can say that in my own personal life, there's been different shadows that were my reality, from feeling insignificant and unimportant and lonely, and from brokenness to feeling like reality was all about trying to be happy, trying to do whatever I could, get whatever toys made me happy, making more money, or anything like that, that became shadows on the wall of my life that were my reality. And eventually all those shadows, just like the flickering of a flame, disappear, and you're left again with nothing. Now, maybe some of you have experienced the same thing in your cave, something appearing to be really real. Maybe it's a relationship, a boyfriend, a girlfriend. Maybe it's sports or whatever. Things that are not bad things, they're good things. But if they're your only thing, then it's not the thing, and you're not walking in reality, and there's only disappointment that will come in the end. And so when you really think of a journey towards beauty and discovering beauty, it's all about discovering the love that God has for you personally. For us to bring beauty to the world around us, to bring greatness to the world around us, you can't bring what you don't have. You can't bring greatness if you don't have greatness. You can't bring beauty if you don't have it. You can't bring love to the world around you if you don't have love to give. And God says, I'm giving you all of that. I am great. I want to put greatness, the seeds of greatness inside of you. That if you have a grateful heart, greatness will spring from your life. And I'm going to put beauty inside of you, in your identity, in your makeup. I created you in my image, and I want it to be discovered and burst out of you. And I want to pour my love into your heart, that love that heals your wounds and covers over your pain and opens you up to the truth, that you can spill it out to the world around you, and that the love of God flows into the world. 1 Corinthians 13, faith, hope, and love. Those are the three that remain. These are the paradigm of reality that we want to experience at greater measures. That will never happen in a cave. That will only happen out in God's world, walking side by side with Him. Now, my question to you is, are you willing to step out of the cave?
That we all have our own perception of reality. And in life's distractions and lies that it tells us, it can be easy to start living in a shadow and not living in God's truth. And that's kind of what Jesus' purpose was when He came down to this earth. I mean, He came down to the early people, the Jews, the Gentiles, and everyone who came after, to say that What you got about God is wrong. This is how God really is. And then he proves that by sacrificing himself and mending that relationship between humans and God. And in the allegory of the cave, Jesus is the chain breaker. And we are left with a choice because there are two kinds of people. Ones who are brought to the entrance of the cave and shown the light, and they choose to live in that truth and live a new life. And those whose chains are unbound, and yet they still choose to live in the darkness. And that was something that was hard for me to wrap my mind around when growing up. I grew up in the church, and my story related a lot to Steve's, in the sense that I understood this religion, but I didn't understand this relationship. And I would hear all these stories of people who had never known Christ their entire lives. And they would hit a really low point. They got involved with drugs, with alcohol. They ended up in jail. And then by some miracle, they saw something, they heard a voice. Someone came into their lives. They suddenly knew Christ. And I had never experienced a miracle, and I had never heard any stories of people who had grown up in the faith and miracles they experienced, so I had nothing to relate to. And so I began to wonder if because I wasn't experiencing hearing God's voice or hearing what his plan for my life was, if something was wrong. And I began to believe that I must have messed up in some way, because that's why God's not communicating with me. He must not love me anymore. I must not be worth anything to him anymore. And this idea surrounded itself around my life, and it began to affect it in different areas. I entered high school, and I started to fall into a depression. I began to close off people from around really knowing who I was inside, letting them know what was going on. I began to believe that people didn't really care, and let alone God didn't really care. And I would ask him over and over again, God, where are you? Life hurts. I don't understand where you are. And again, I thought I had been abandoned by him, because I would keep finding ways to prove that over and over to myself. And it wasn't until I graduated high school and I went on a mission trip with our very own youth group. We went to New Mexico. We went with a Next Step trip. And the speaker that week talked about on the first night, why are you here? And he presented that question to us. And he said something about that, you may not realize it yet, but you are here this week for a specific reason, and God has a plan for you. And that question struck me hard, because I was so convinced that there was no longer a plan for me. They had gone so far off the deep end. But he asked us that question, and he asked us to think about it the entire week. And so I did, and I kept asking it over and over again. And on the last night of worship, as the week's coming to a close, he brought it back up, and he asked if we had found the answer. To me, I hadn't found the answer, and I was disappointed. And so I, as he was speaking, I prayed one last time, just, God, why am I here this week? What's your plan? I'm about to go off to college, and I don't know what you want me to do. And I don't even know if there's a purpose for me. And for the first time in my life, my mind was completely silent. The way my mind works, I'm constantly thinking about one idea or the next and overthinking it and moving on to the next thing. But it was silent because I felt I had nothing left. And in that moment, I saw what I would describe as a slideshow of my life. I saw from memories from an early age, looking at the mountains over behind Tucson and seeing them and how beautiful they were. And how could that be random? There must be a creator. And it moved on to different points in my life with my loving family and the friends I did have and the things they would say to encourage me. And I saw moments where I know God must have intervened in my life, but I had written it off as coincidence. Moments where I was almost struck by lightning, and yet I believe God saved me, and things like that. And at that moment, I heard, or better way to describe it, I felt a voice say, "How much more proof do you need to know that I am with you?" And in that moment, I sat up straight, and what had happened had only taken a second, but it had felt like a lifetime of things coming together and just making sense. And the thing that made the most sense was that I was wrong. And it felt like this weight was lifted off my shoulders because I was wrong. God's love is not conditional. You don't have to earn grace. In fact, it's unconditional, and you just have to accept it because it's a gift that's been given to you. And that was this shadow that had surrounded my life, but yet knowing the truth in that moment, I didn't turn my life around. God did. And I would share that story every Tuesday night to a group of people every single week. And every time I would share that story, at least one person would approach me and they would share something with me with the exact same result, no matter what the story was. That they didn't change their life around. God did. And so that goes into this concept about seeing the light coming out of the cave. For each and every one of us, the shadow is different. Maybe you struggle with depression, knowing self-worth. Maybe you struggle with some sin, and maybe it's something that's not all that bad. Maybe there's something that kind of takes up your time, fills up your life, that maybe could be considered a distraction. I mean, your job, your house, materials, even things like a wife and a husband, a girlfriend, a boyfriend, as Steve said, things that aren't bad things. But they're not the only thing, and they're not the thing that's permanent. And so without God in the center of your relationships, without God in the center of your life, the way you work, you're living in a shadow. And the last thing I'll leave you with is that we all need that reminder. I constantly need the reminder each and every day that I am loved and I am saved by grace. We constantly need that reminder to pull us out of the shadows that we live in. To realize that moment when we need to take a step back and give it all to God. Because we need to live in His life, not in the shadows that the world tells us to live in. Amen.